All right, welcome back. So, going on to the third main point here. This is actually one of my favorite sections in the first part of the book. I've looked at this a number of times over the years. He gets more into detail about language, which of course will be a big theme throughout the book, but here he really summarizes well, I think, some of his basic ideas about language. So let's get into it. So number 3, reference to concord of consequences as the determinant of meaning of any sound used as a medium of communication shows that there is no such thing as a mere word or mere symbol. Right, so just kind of review. Concord of consequences, agreement or harmony in the consequences through the medium of language is determinant of the meaning of the marks that we use, the sounds that we use to communicate with each other. That communication is, or the consequence of that communication is, hopefully, agreement or concord in action, in consequences, although sometimes there are misunderstandings and the wrong thing happens. But anyway, meaning happens through concord of consequences. So no such thing as a mere word or mere symbol, because meaning is not isolated from the world. It's a thing that is enacted, that is a social consequence. The physical existence, so the physical existence that is the vehicle of meaning, may as a particular be called mere. So you could have a mere symbol in the physical sense. A mark on a paper could be a mere mark on it. You could talk about the mere traces on a piece of paper. The physical existence. So vehicle of meaning, of course, if you know the work of Charles Sanders Peirce, and I've mentioned before that Dewey was very much influenced by Peirce, although not the extent of Peirce's works were not really well known during Dewey's time because they were not really available to the public, most of them. And I guess still quite a lot are still not available. But anyway, Peirce would talk about the sign vehicle. So the physical existence that is the vehicle of meaning may as a particular be called mere. The recitation of a number of such sounds or the stringing together of such marks may be called mere language. So kind of not using language, but just producing strings of word-like sounds we could maybe talk about as mere language. But in fact, there is no word in the first case and no language in the second. The activities that occur and the consequences that result, which are not determined by meaning, are, by description, only physical. So not meaningful, so just kind of an unintentional, let us say for now, unintentional imitation of speech-like sounds, language-like sounds, are not meaningful, of course, are just physical things, physical existences, mere physical things. A sound or mark of any physical existence is a part of language only in virtue of its operational force. That is, as it functions as a means of evoking different activities performed by different persons, so as to produce consequences that are shared by all the participants in the conjoint undertaking. So language is something operational. It gets things to happen. It's a medium for producing things, for making things happen, right? And I've been wanting to say at some point it would be interesting to compare this to the works of Saussure. There's not that much directly written by Saussure, Saussure. I believe first name Ferdinand. There was 2 Saussures, but I sometimes get them confused. But Ferdinand de Saussure, I believe, was the linguist. I think they might have both been involved in linguistics. Anyway, but the separation in Saussure between parole and langage, between speech and language as a system, and it's hard to tell how strictly Saussure wanted to make that distinction. Maybe it's just kind of a pragmatic analytical thing. But anyway, in the case of Dewey, it's clear that language does not have an independent existence as a system. Of course, we can analyze it as a system, as maybe an independent system, but language as a part of life, language itself, like the essence of language, is that it is operational. It's part of our life activities. It affects social coordination and things like that. So it's operational. Language is operational. So it functions as a means of evoking different activities performed by different persons so as to produce consequences that are shared by all the participants in the conjoint undertaking. Notice this emphasis on the sociality of it, of working together. This is where the real nature of language is for Dewey. This fact is evident and direct in oral communication, so speech, right? Speaking. This is more obvious. It is indirect and disguised in written communication. Where written literature and literacy abound, the conception of language is likely to be framed upon their model. So we're likely to think about language through the perspective of written language because that's such an important part of our life, and it's kind of easier to conceptualize language in its written manifestation, right? Because you can see it, you can hold a paper of writing, hold a book, and that seems like a real kind of language that you can look at carefully and analyze. But of course, writing came much later than spoken language, but serves basically the same purpose, although it's harder to see that because words on paper just seem to sit there. We can ignore them more easily, right? So cultures that have written language, there's going to be more of a confusion there about the nature of language because written language is in some ways very different from spoken language because it's more permanent. It's you can treat it in many different ways, easier to ignore, like I said. The intrinsic connection of language with community of action is then forgotten. Yes, written language also can be more individualistic, right? Because the speaker is not there anymore. You're engaging with an object rather than with another person. So the social aspect is more disguised, but it's still there. The intrinsic connection of language with community of action is then forgotten. Language is then supposed to be simply a means of expressing or communicating thoughts, a means of conveying ideas or meanings that are complete in themselves apart from communal operational force. This is kind of an older view of language, right? Or maybe a traditional view. I mean, it's still current. People still think this, that the purpose of language is to express thoughts, just, full stop. Not to express those thoughts for some purpose, but just to express thoughts. But then we would want to ask with Dewey, why do we have this need to express thoughts? Why should we express our thoughts? Why can we not just keep them to ourselves? Obviously, we want to do something with those thoughts. We want them to affect people. We want to, I want to say, control is a word you could use, but that's a little bit too rigid. But we want to affect people, right? We want to influence. Maybe that's a better word. Influence people, influence what they believe, how they feel, what they do. So going on, much literature is read, moreover, simply for enjoyment, for aesthetic purposes. In this case, language is a means of action only as it leads the reader to build up pictures and scenes to be enjoyed by himself. So language is still doing something when we read a novel. It leads us to imagine things, build up images. There ceases to be immediate inherent reference to conjoint activity and to consequences mutually participated in. So it seems like there's no longer this social aspect to language. However, there's a however coming. So such is not the case, however, in reading to get at the meaning of the author. Right? When you're trying to figure out, if you're just enjoying something in a kind of individualistic way and you don't care about what the person was trying to say or trying to do by writing this, then maybe it doesn't matter. Or the social aspect maybe doesn't matter so much. But some of us want to know, what was the author trying to do? Why did this person write this in this way? So, reading to get at the meaning of the author. That is, in reading that is emphatically intellectual, in distinction from aesthetic. In the mere reading of a scientific treatise, there is indeed no direct overt participation in action with another to produce consequences that are common in the sense of being immediately and personally shared. So if you just read a scientific treatise, you're not producing immediate shared consequences with, say, the author. But there must be imaginative construction of the materials and operations which led the author to certain conclusions, and there must be agreement or disagreement with his conclusions as a consequence of following through conditions and operations that are imaginatively reinstated. So there's a kind of, maybe we would call it virtual association or virtual socialization or something like that, where you are, the author is producing consequences in you by your reading of his or her words. You're doing something that agrees or disagrees with the author, and that's a kind of social behavior, right? Even though it's very mediated, indirect, but you can think of writing as a way of expanding our social influence, influencing people who are not directly acting along with us, not directly behaving with us. Let me just quickly check if I have any important notes I want to bring up here. No, I don't think so. So, connection with overt activities is, in such a case, indirect or mediated. Yeah, it's like I was saying. So, through writing, there's a kind of indirect or mediated social behavior. But so far as definite grounded agreement or disagreement is reached, an attitude is formed, which is a preparatory readiness to act in a responsive way when the conditions in question or others similar to them actually present themselves. So, through reading a book, there's a readiness to act. Reading a scientific treatise, there's a readiness to act if such conditions were to be present. The connection with action in question is, in other words, with possible ways of operation rather than those found to be actually and immediately required. So it's also a kind of extension in time, extension in space. So you're not preparing to act in the immediate environment necessarily when you read something like I would even say a novel or a scientific treatise. But you're preparing for action perhaps in the future or in another place, in another context, another environment that might be more closely related to what you are reading than your present environment. But preparation for possible action in situations not as yet existent in actuality is an essential condition of and factor in all intelligent behavior. So intelligent behavior, not just acting with respect to what is immediately in front of you now, but thinking about future consequences, right? How does this bear on tomorrow, on next month, on in this other context that I might be in the future? When persons meet together in conference to plan in advance of actual occasions and emergencies what shall later be done, or when an individual deliberates in advance regarding his possible behavior in a possible future contingency, something occurs, but more directly of the same sort as happens in understanding intellectually the meaning of a scientific treatise. So comparing the reading of a scientific treatise to people meeting to discuss plans about what they should do in the future. So it's more indirect, but it's the same sort of a thing. Intelligent behavior. I turn now to the positive implication of the fact that no sound, mark, product of art is a word or part of language in isolation. Any word or phrase has the meaning which it has only as a member of a constellation of related meanings. This again gets at Saussure a bit, who was largely considering language as a system. He saw this as produced through social interaction, of course, as Dewey does. But of course, this idea was also circulating at the time through the work of Saussure. I think, I forget the exact date. It was earlier than Dewey's Logic, although Dewey had written about language also before the Logic. So I don't know who was first or if it matters, but this idea of language as a system was very much in the air, where you can't understand a word in isolation. There are no isolated words. Meaning is relational, we can say. So any word or phrase has the meaning which it has only as a member of a constellation of related meanings. Words as representatives are part of an inclusive code, which we might call language, a language. The code may be public or private. This is an interesting distinction. Private is maybe not what you think. There was also discussions around this time of private languages. This is not, which it would be like a totally personal, individual language, kind of an internal language. This is not what Dewey's going to be talking about. But a public code is illustrated in any language that is current in a given cultural group. A private code is one agreed on by members of special groups, so as to be unintelligible to those who have not been initiated. So, kind of broad cultural groups versus more specialist subculture groups. Between these two come argots of special groups in a community and the technical codes invented for a restricted special purpose, like the one used by ships at sea. But in every case, a particular word has its meaning only in relation to the code of which it is one constituent. So the meanings are relational, in relation to the whole code, the whole system of meanings, using system in a kind of loose way. I believe Dewey will also use the term system. The distinction just drawn between meanings that are determined respectively in fairly direct connection with action in situations that are present or near at hand, and meanings determined for possible use in remote and contingent situations provides the basis upon which language codes as systems may be differentiated into two main kinds. So the language of immediate action, immediate consequence, and the language, as in a scientific treatise, of a more displaced, distance kind of use. Use in remote and contingent situations. Situations that might happen at some time, in the future. While all language or symbol meanings are what they are as parts of a system, it does not follow that they have been determined on the basis of their fitness to be such members of a system, much less on the basis of their membership in a comprehensive system. So we can think of language as a system, but not all languages are, we might say, systematically constructed. I think the language of kind of the common language is not a systematic product. It just arises through our daily activities. We don't kind of plan to produce a coherent system of meanings. And so it's not a coherent system of meanings in the broad sense, as a kind of a broad system. It's very incoherent in a way, but it gets us through many practical circumstances, right? The system may be simply the language in common use, as I was just describing. Its meanings hang together not in virtue of their examined relationship to one another, but because they are current in the same set of group habits and expectations, right? So the meanings hang together not because we've decided that they fit together in a logical way, but just because they function well enough in our habits, in our behaviors, in our near-term expectations, and so on. They hang together because of group activities, group interests, customs, and institutions. Scientific language, on the other hand, is subject to a test over and above this criterion. So scientific language is not just about getting us through practical situations well enough. It's not just about deriving meaning from particular special group interests or custom, tradition, social institutions. We need to think about it a little bit differently, be a little more careful. Each meaning that enters into the language, the scientific language, is expressly determined in its relations to other members of the language system. I think this is maybe an ideal, maybe we should say should be determined in its relations to other members of the language system. I feel like it is not always done in this intentional of a way. Scientists are people, and also regular people as well as being scientists, and they tend sometimes to import words into scientific language that are maybe not fully logically analyzed and set in a coherent relation with other terms in that scientific language. Anyway, in all reasoning or ordered discourse, this criterion takes precedence over that instituted by connection with cultural habits. So reasoning or ordered discourse, so the use of the development of meanings through use of language. This criterion of determining meaning in relation to other meanings, specifically, explicitly, is more important than the connection of words with cultural habits. Let's see where I am here. Okay, a couple more paragraphs for this section. Some of these sections in this part are a little bit longer than I would ideally like, but I'm trying to keep the numbered parts together. All right, so kind of finishing up here, starting to finish up. The resulting difference in the two types of language meanings fundamentally fixes the difference between what is called common sense and what is called science. There's going to be a whole chapter, I think. A whole chapter, maybe the next chapter, is about this difference and relation between common sense and science. So it's a little bit of a preview here, of course. So common sense language and scientific language, there's a basic difference. In the former cases, the customs, the ethos, and spirit of a group is the decisive factor in determining the system of meanings in use. the system is one in a practical and institutional sense rather than in an intellectual sense. So institutional rather than intellectual. So again, determined through custom, through practical consequences, rather than through reflecting specifically and explicitly on the words in question. Meanings that are formed on this basis are sure to contain much that is irrelevant and to exclude much that is required for intelligent control of activity. So they're going to have extra stuff in there, extra meanings, then might be useful for this or that given purpose, and maybe they might not have what would be useful, maybe more useful for this or that practical situation. So they'll contain much that is irrelevant, exclude much that is required, if we're really trying to be intelligent in our use of language. The meanings are coarse, and many of them are inconsistent with each other from a logical point of view. One meaning is appropriate to action under certain institutional group conditions, another in some other situation, and there is no attempt to relate the different situations to one another in a coherent scheme. I believe he'll give examples, but the use of certain words in maybe raising a family might differ from how you use those words in conducting business, which might be different in how words are used in a religious context, and so on. And there's no real kind of consistent attempt to distinguish those. We kind of slip and slide through these different meanings as we go through different institutions, business institutions, educational, familial, governmental, all these different kinds of institutions that we have, where we are kind of using the same words, but they take on different shades of meaning, different aspects as we move through the institutions, but they also carry baggage from from the other institutions. So it's things get a little complicated and more or less work out, but not always. And in science, we're trying to be more rigorous, more strict about this. So there's more consistency about how we use words so that our behavior will be more precise and not just good enough, but actually precise in the details, because the details are what matter in solving complicated problems, as you might in scientific contexts. Anyway, going on, if I can find my place here. Yeah, so there's no attempt to relate the different situations to one another in a coherent scheme. Right, all these different, familial, governmental, scientific, educational, commercial, and so on situations. We don't really attempt to relate them to each other and to make our language consistent and so on. In an intellectual sense, there are many languages, though in a social sense there is but one. So there's kind of the common social language, but when we look at it more reflectively, you could also think about it as many languages, because we use a different kind of aspect of the language, a different set of meanings, again, imperfectly, coarsely, as we move through different institutions. This multiplicity of language meaning constellations is also a mark of our existing culture. A word means one thing in relation to a religious institution, still another thing in business, a third thing in law, and so on. So as I was saying, in different institutions, words can mean different things. And we don't always notice this. We aren't explicit about it necessarily. So we get confused. This fact is the real Babel of communication. Of course, referring to the Tower of Babel, biblical story. There is an attempt now making to propagate the idea that education which indoctrinates individuals into some special tradition provides the way out of this confusion. So can we solve this confusion of multiple languages through education. Dewey is skeptical. He says, aside from the fact that there are, in fact, a considerable number of traditions, and that selection of some one of them, even though that one be internally consistent and extensively accepted, is arbitrary, the attempt reverses the theoretical state of the case. A confusing sentence. Let's just admit that. So yeah, in education, there's many traditions. Choosing one of them is arbitrary. But anyway, this reverses what he says calls the theoretical state of the case. The next sentence will clarify that. Genuine community of language or symbols can be achieved only through efforts that bring about community of activities under existing conditions. The ideal of scientific language is construction of a system in which meanings are related to one another in inference and discourse, and where the symbols are such as to indicate the relation. So maybe we'll take that first sentence. So genuine community of language symbols can be achieved only through efforts that bring about community of activities. So bringing about community activities. It's not enough to just try to get our words straight through teaching that this word means such and such, but that has to be produced through bringing about a community of activities under existing conditions, which is why he thinks this education focus is reversing things. So it's because the words are already being determined for students in their practical situations, right? So you can't, just trying to impose new meanings on top of that can just add to the confusion. You need to address those activities themselves, which are already kind of determining how words are being used. And then last sentence in this paragraph, the ideal of scientific language is to construct a system in which meanings are carefully related to one another. Related to one another in inference, so going from existential things to theories or generalizations. This will come up later. And discourse, where you're developing meanings, trying to creating new meanings. So we want, in scientific language, we want to construct a system where meanings are carefully related to each other in terms of the inference, in our inferential behaviors. So going back and forth between existences and more general concepts, and through our development of ideas in discourse. Right. All right, and last part of section 3 here. I shall now introduce the word symbol, giving it its signification as a synonym for a word as a word. That is, as a meaning carried by language in a system, whether the system be of the loose or the intellectual rigorous kind. I'm going to try to remember to come back to that footnote. The especial point in the introduction of the word symbol is to institute the means by which discrimination between what is designated by it and what is now often designated by sign may be instituted. What I have called symbols are often called artificial signs, in distinction from what are called natural signs. And this will be the topic of the next section, the distinction between sign and symbol, natural sign and artificial sign, and what that has to do with logic. So that will be the next section. Let's see, there was a footnote here. Do we need to look at that? Footnote 3, I'm not going to show it on the screen because that not quite set up for that, but it says this signification, so the signification of symbol as a synonym for word as a word, so a meaning system, a meaning within a system of language, This signification is narrower than the popular usage, according to which anything is a symbol that has representative emotional force, even if that force be independent of its intellectual representational force. In this wider sense, a national flag, a crucifix, a mourning garb, etc., are symbols. Right? So we think about the American flag, or any country's flag, for those people is a kind of symbol in one sense, right? We talk about the flag as being a symbol of a people or a people's ideals or traditions or something like that, with an emotional content, right? People get emotional sometimes thinking about the flag or religious symbols, a crucifix or other religious symbol, or some just important object that they have from their past, maybe. So there's that wider meaning of symbol. In some semiotic systems, there's a meaning, another word for this kind of symbol, which I am blanking on, I think. But anyway, it's another kind of symbol, or way of thinking about symbol, popular way of thinking about symbols. In this wider sense, I read that. So the definition of the text is insofar arbitrary. So the definition that Dewey is giving is arbitrary to some extent, because it's ignoring this wider meaning. But there is nothing arbitrary about the subject matters to which the limited signification applies. So the thing he's talking about is a real thing. It's an important thing that needs to be talked about. And this actually illustrates this difficulty with common sense language in relation to scientific language, because the words that we use in science are often taken from the common sense language, and they have more or less meaning than we would like, but we don't always want to be inventing totally new words in science, or it would be totally, incomprehensible and specialized, and only a few people could ever understand it. It'd be like learning a whole new language, like learning Japanese or Spanish or whatever, if you're an English speaker. So we use most of the common, we take most of, so the words in science are mostly taken from the everyday language. And there's not much you can do about this, but it causes some confusions, because you might want to be talking about some very specific thing, like Dewey is talking about symbol in a very specific sense, talking about words, language symbols, linguistic symbols, as opposed to other kinds of signs that he will talk about. And we need a word for that, right? And unfortunately, the words that we have the meaning might be broader or more confused or whatever, contain different things that maybe are irrelevant to what we actually want to discuss. And that's just one of the hazards of using language, but I've gone on too long about that. Probably we'll be reading more about that in the next section, where we talk more about signs in relation to symbols. So I will stop here. That's all for now. Thank you.